deck now. There we go. Hello. Welcome, friends. We'll get started in just a few minutes as we wait for the room to fill up. Welcome, welcome. And I'm going to put a link in the chat box. This is for today's document. It's an organic document. I'll add to it as the presentation happens. Hello, hello. Thank you for joining us today. Hello. I've done this 20 million times. You'd think that I would unmute myself by now, right? All right, let's start over. Back in time. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Anissa. I'm a librarian here at San Francisco Public Library. I do virtual programming. I do in-person programming. And all of our locations are now open, doing programming 7 days a week, all locations. And you can find us, and we'll do lots and lots of stuff. So we have May is AANHPI month, Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander month, and we have a lot of programs for that. And following that, we have summer, which we're super excited about. And I'm sure we'll be joining with our partners at the park services. And keep your ears open for some amazing things. I know what they are, but we're not ready to share. So keep a lookout at your location for special treats all summer with our National Park System soulmates. We want to acknowledge that the library occupies the unceded and ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone people, who are the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula. We recognize that we benefit from living and working on their traditional homeland, and as uninvited guests, we affirm their sovereign rights as First Peoples and wish to pay our respects to the ancestors, elders, and relatives of the Ramaytush community. I just want to tell you about some upcoming programs. Tonight at Medicine for Nightmares, we have author and poets Jennifer Chang and Diana Coy Nguyen, and they're going to be talking about the wildness of parenthood and writing. And that's going to be at 7 p.m. at our partners, again, Medicine for Nightmare, the Mission's Best Bookstore. And if you haven't been there, it's beautiful. So come check it out. It's very community oriented, and we'll have books for sale, and we'll have some cheese and some wine, some crackers. So come on out, check out the bookstore, check out the event. Tomorrow in our main library, we have Japanese superfoods author, and this is going to be on our 5th floor. You can always ask the info desk. I know the main library is big and vast, and you walk in there and you're just like, wait, where do I go? So don't hesitate to ask us. I'm super excited. If you are from San Francisco, then you probably know Annie Sprinkle and her partner, Beth Stevens. And this is going to be our second annual Earth Day Ecosexual Walking Tour. And we're going to go walk through Bernal Heights and go up to Holly Park. And Annie and Beth are both ecosexuals. They love Earth. They have an Earth lab and they're residents of Bernal Heights. So they know everybody there and it is a super fun tour. Come out next Saturday, the 22nd on Earth Day. We're going to meet in front of the Bernal Heights Library and it will be super fun. I promise it will not disappoint. And it's acceptable for all ages. It's an accessible park. There are some stairs. And then if you have been up there on the hill, you know it can get windy, so bring layers as usual in San Francisco. So I did want to say one other event that's coming up that I don't have a slide for is the amazing Segurite Land Trust, an all-women-led organization out of the East Bay. We have them on a virtual library event, but you can also pop into the Excelsior branch if you want to watch it live via Zoom. They'll have it set up for their program room. And our librarian there will be in conversation with none other than Karina Gould, who is a just amazing matriarch. So please come check that out. And today we're here to learn about the different types of San Francisco Bay Area and Marin regional forest health and strategy, and why resilient forests are important to a healthy ecosystem and community. And it is Climate Action Month, and this is why we're so excited to have Danny Franco from the Parks Conservancy joining us today. And I'm going to stop sharing. You're welcome to use the chat or the Q&A at any time, and we'll keep it flowing like that. Everyone, please welcome Danny.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to get my screen share going. Let me know when you can see those slides.
We're good to go.
Awesome. Cool. Well, thanks for the introduction. My name is Danny Franco. I do work for the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy. We are part of the One TAM Collaborative, which is a collaborative of 4 land managing agencies based in Marin County. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about that in a second, give you some background on the collaborative. Today, I'm here to share about some work that I've been doing for the past 3 years that's just wrapping up. So I have a new slide deck to share with you all. So bear with me as I work through it, and definitely put questions in the chat. I would love to engage with you all and answer your questions. I hope that this topic is compelling for you, and that my presentation is not too technical, but yeah, all feedback is always welcome. So thank you in advance for your honest feedback and good questions today. Before I get started, I do want to also just acknowledge that One TAM and the work that happens in Marin County under the One TAM umbrella is on Coast Miwok land. So just acknowledging that the forest health strategy has tried to integrate Coast Miwok perspectives, and we have worked in partnership with the Federated Indians of Grant and Rancheria, who are the representatives of Coast Miwok and Southern Pomo in Marin and Sonoma counties. Unfortunately, the tribe is not here today, and most of what I'll be presenting on is from a Western academic perspective. So that's a limitation, really, and doesn't include a lot of the traditional tribal knowledge and information that the tribe holds, some of which is included in our strategic planning document. So just holding some space for the Coast Miwok people and their perspective, even though they're not here today. So with that, I'll get started. Just a quick outline of what I'm going to talk and share with you about the Marin Regional Forest Health Strategy. I will start with just some background on why we took on this strategic planning effort, and I'll do my best to make it relevant to you all, whether you're in San Francisco or Castro Valley or somewhere else. I think a lot of these themes are relevant anywhere where there's forests. I'll give you some insight into the process that we went through. Really just a high level overview of the process that we undertook as part of our strategic planning effort. I'll spend a good amount of time sharing on key findings. I think there's a lot to share there, and so I'll try to kind of keep my facts and figures at a relatively high level. But yeah, I think that you'll find it really interesting what we've discovered about the health of forests in our region, specifically in Marin County, and what's impacting those. We'll talk about the distribution of forests and forest types. I'll touch on climate change and what anticipated changes in climate may mean for forests in our region. I'll talk about the impact of fire exclusion, and I'll define that for you, so hang tight. We'll talk about impact of forest disease, and then I'll end with just kind of what's next steps for us, and I'll include some information about how you could get involved or learn more about this work. So starting with just some background of the why and the what of healthy forests. So forests and the natural processes that take place within them provide benefits for all living creatures. In Marin County, there are 24 distinct forest types. They include conifer types, such as coast redwood and Douglas fir, oak woodland, and grassland savannas, evergreen hardwoods like Pacific madrone, and fire-dependent forests like stands of bishop pine. Forest ecosystems provide habitat for wildlife such as bats, salmon, and in this picture, northern spotted owls, looking very cute, a mama owl and her baby, and so much more, right? The forests are just so rich with wildlife and biodiversity. Another interesting fact in Marin is that 3/4 of Marin's water comes from the heavily forested Mount Tamalpais watershed. So Mount Tamalpais is the tallest peak in Marin County, and the water district up there has most of the water. 3/4 of the water from Marin County comes from Mount Tam. Without healthy and resilient forests, Marin's water quality and quantity is vulnerable to threats like erosion and sedimentation. So forests already providing so much for the humans in that space. Trees breathe in carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas that traps heat and contributes to climate change. Trees breathe out the oxygen that humans need. Forests store carbon in their biomass, which can get released in the event of a high severity wildfire, which just adds more carbon dioxide to the air, contributing to climate change. So we need healthy, resilient forests to help us manage our greenhouse gas emissions and to limit the impacts of climate change. Lastly, but very importantly, the forested parklands and protected open spaces in Marin provide people with opportunities to get outdoors and exercise. Exercise, those are activities that are healthy for the body and the mind. These areas also draw millions of visitors each year to Marin County, which generates revenue for local government and businesses and creates jobs. Those are just some of the things that forests provide. So a little bit more background now on the One TAM partnership. That's the group that I worked with to develop this strategy and do this deep dive on forest health in Marin County. The One TAM collaborative is made up, as I mentioned at the top, of the 4 land managing agencies that all manage a piece of Mount Tamalpais in Marin County. Going clockwise, that's the National Park Service, Marin Municipal Water District, California State Parks, Marin County Parks, and then lastly, the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy. That's my employer. We're the nonprofit member of this collaborative. The collaborative was established in 2014. And was established to build on the unique talents and strengths of each partner agency. The partnership provides a platform to work collaboratively and across jurisdictional boundaries for the benefit of community and the environment. And we do lots of fun stuff. We've got links to our website in this PowerPoint, which we can share after the presentation and make available online. Definitely encourage you to check out our website. Lots of events and things that you can participate in, both virtually and in person. Sticking with background for just a little bit more, I always start my introduction to this forest health work that we've been doing in Marin with a different report called Measuring the Health of the Mountain, which was one of the first initiatives that the One TAM Collaborative took on after being established in 2014. The peak health report was important because it established baseline conditions for the health of natural resources on Mount Tamalpais. They did this by working with scientists and community and land managers to do kind of a deep dive on all of the available data around key ecological communities, wildlife species, vegetation types on the mountain to really try and assess, what's going on. The Peak Health Report highlighted the need to work with partners to address threats to forest ecosystem function, including introduced weeds, plant diseases, and fire exclusion, and the need for more data at the countywide scale. So countywide spatial vegetation data was something that was highlighted in this report as a data gap, as a need. So a key takeaway from this report was that forests in Marin can benefit from active management, so more of a hands-on stewardship-focused approach. Big picture questions like, how do we approach this challenge of managing forests, and where should partners focus management actions? Where across the vast landscape, right, can we focus our precious time? And questions like, what does the data and science say? All of that underscored the need for us to take on this strategic planning effort. So staying with background, and I won't read through all of this slide, but I think it's just important to kind of provide some statewide context for this initiative. Funding for this work came from California Climate Investments. So the state has this cap and trade program that provides funding that will for work that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions and strengthen the economy and improve public health and the environment. From that investment fund that's at the state level, one of the state agencies that helps manage forests, the California Natural Resources Agency, developed a program that really focused on providing funds for the planning and implementation of projects to improve forest health. That's what all that says. And you can read it on your own. Later on, if you're interested, in all of these links will take you to more information about those statewide programs. And then lastly, the California State Coastal Conservancy got a chunk of this funds and spread it around the Bay Area. So we're one of four, One TAM and the Parks Conservancy are one of four sub-grantees under this program to fund various forest health and fuels reduction projects in East Bay. Someone typed Castro Valley earlier into the chat, so we do have some East Bay people. I'm talking to you from Oakland today, so East Bay Regional Parks got some of that funding, the Santa Cruz RCD, and of course One TAM. Okay, so that's it on background. I'll tell you a little bit more now about the process that we went through to develop this strategic plan. First, we started with developing goals for the health and resilience of key forest types to protect or enhance ecosystem services like clean water, carbon sequestration, and wildlife habitat, right? All of those benefits that I talked about in the introduction. So you don't have to understand this big complicated graphic. It's really just meant to underscore that we went through a really long process with our partners, engaging in conversation to really break down how forests work and where there might be ecological stressors and threats. So using that vegetation map that was a data gap identified in the Peak Health Report, we worked to identify the distribution of key forest types across Marin County. So this is a spatial map of all of the different vegetation communities in Marin. I think there's like 100 different vegetation communities and land cover classes in this map. This is the distribution of the 5 key forest types in Marin County from that map. The 5 key forest types are coast redwood, Douglas fir forest, open canopy oak woodlands, Sargent cypress, which is a kind of a pygmy forest that grows on serpentine soils, and then bishop pine, which is kind of concentrated up here by Tamales Bay on the Point Reyes Peninsula in Marin County. Oh, there, you can probably see my cursor now. Bishop pine up here. With this data, we work to quantify and locate threats to forest health and resilience, and I'll dig into these results a little bit more in subsequent slides. And then we created a framework for identifying priority projects and various treatment approaches. So like I said at the beginning, we only have so much precious time and resources to work on forest health. And so we really wanted to provide our partner agencies a framework for, prioritizing that precious time and money for where they can best focus their work to have the greatest impact. And lastly, the forest health strategy kind of describes methods for monitoring treatment outcomes and landscape changes. So kind of create that feedback loop so that we can learn from the projects that we implement. Okay. Here's a little bit of more info on forest distribution. So just some fun facts about forests in Marin. There are 118,000 acres of forest and woodland in Marin County. That's equivalent to an area of 184 square miles, or 4 times the size of all of San Francisco. So if you took all of San Francisco City County and you painted it with trees 4 times over, that's how much forest we have in Marin. So forests cover, a third of all the land in Marin County. Lots of forested lands. The one-TAM partners plus Point Reyes National Seashore, which is the National Park Service, manages about half of all of the native forests in Marin, so about 60,000 acres. This represents a really important opportunity to address threats to forest health and increase forest resilience at landscape scale, right? All of that forested land that's managed by our partners comes with a lot of responsibility, but it means that our partners are in a really great position to do good work to increase the resilience and health of forests. This is important. I won't take you all the way through this table. It's really meant to underscore that the different types of forests and the conditions are not, uniform across the landscape. And so that collaboration is really key to maximizing the impact of our collective work. For a quick example, most of the hardwoods in the county fall on county parks lands, right? Like most of the evergreen and deciduous hardwoods are on county parks lands that are protected, while most of the coast redwood forests are on Marin water lands. That's the water district lands. And so, working together, we can kind of improve the health of these different forest types, even though they may not all fall within one partner's lands. So let's talk about climate change a little bit with respect to this work. By 2100, average temperatures in the Bay Area will likely rise by 1.7 to 2.2 degrees Celsius, possibly as much as 4.4 degrees Celsius, depending on the future greenhouse gas emissions. And just as a reminder, 1 degree Fahrenheit is equal to 1.8 degrees Celsius. So that's actually higher, right? It's more in terms of Fahrenheit. Vegetation can become incompatible with extremes of heat and drought. The Bay Area's future climate could be less suitable for evergreen conifer forests such as coast redwood, and more favorable for hotter, drier, adapted vegetation such as chaparral and grasslands. So climate change is already increasing the frequency and severity of fires, as we know well here in the Bay Area. And as I mentioned previously, those do result in carbon emissions, further contributing to climate change. management, including the use of beneficial fire, and I'll talk about what that means in a little bit, but you probably have already heard of prescribed fire. Management may reduce the long-term carbon loss and accelerate carbon sequestration by moving towards larger, more mature, more fire-resilient forests. And so bigger trees able to withstand wildfire, survive wildfire. Longer-lived trees like coast redwood may not be able to reach equilibrium with new climate conditions quickly enough to keep up with the pace of a changing climate and may be vulnerable to transition in the event of a disturbance due to vegetation-climate mismatch. So that's a kind of a complicated way of saying that, you know, if you have a disturbance like a wildfire, typically a forest would be able to recover from that experience. Some of you may have heard about the wildfires down in Big Basin in 2020 that impacted coast redwood forests down there. The concern among scientists is that if the climate gets so out of sync with what the vegetation types or the forest types are used to, have evolved to live in, when you get that big wildfire that comes through and damages a forest, the forest might not come back the same. It might come back a different forest type or not a forest at all because the conditions no longer are suitable for that particular forest type. So here's a quick map that's got lots of detail but it just kind of underscores this basic concept here that, you know, currently we have this distribution of forests that I shared about previously in Marin County and elsewhere in the Bay Area. And depending on which climate change scenario manifests over the next, 60 years, whether we get a hotter, drier scenario or a hotter, wetter scenario, and these are, average temperatures, right? So 7 degrees hotter on average, and then maybe wetter, which feels true this year, or drier, can have a change in sort of the composition and distribution of forested types across the landscape. Let's talk about fire exclusion, which has some intersection with the legacy of colonization and the history of Coast Miwok people in this landscape in Marin County. So the term fire exclusion includes both modern fire suppression, so that's like wildland firefighting, and the interruption of Coast Miwok burning due to European colonization. Without fire, the landscape changes significantly. As I mentioned at the outset, all the land in what is now known in Marin County, known as Marin County, is Coast Miwok land. This is explored in a whole chapter of the Forest Health Strategy. It's the 3rd chapter, Indigenous Stewardship and Tribal Partnership. By design, California Native Americans, including the Coast Miwok, created cultural landscapes with fire where grassland and tan oak groves thrived in a region naturally dominated by coniferous forests. So Coast Miwok people tend the land to cultivate different vegetation types for different uses, from food sources to basketry to tools, to creating better hunting or gathering spaces. And one of the tools that they use for millennia to steward the landscape is fire. That fire had an impact on the evolution of the vegetation communities and the way that we see vegetation communities represented on the landscape. Indigenous stewardship of conifer forests, especially the use of fire to thin and open the tall, dense canopy, allows associated species like tan oak, hazelnut, huckleberries to thrive and creates much more food habitat for humans and animals in areas that would otherwise become like a food desert if left untended. Many plants in Marin County are adapted to disturbance regimes such as fire, and in some cases, including Sargent cypress, the pygmy cypress that I mentioned, and bishop pine forests up by Tomales Bay are dependent on fire for regeneration. So without fire, some forest species like bishop pine, Sargent cypress, and other vegetation communities could eventually disappear from the landscape. So this map is a map of Coast Miwok settlements. It's from an ethnography by Collier and Thalman. And, I wish the tribe were here today to share more about this, but we're thankful that we were able to collaborate with the tribe on a chapter in the Forest Health Strategy, which daylights some of that Indigenous knowledge and stewardship practices that I touched on in this slide. So let's talk a little bit more about these impacts of fire exclusion and both putting out of naturally occurring wildfires and also the interruption of Coast Miwok burning. Fire exclusion produces changes in the fuel structure, forest structure, and floristic composition. So for example, just closing the canopy and a shift to more shade-tolerant vegetation species, especially within coast redwood and Douglas fir forests. So fire is an important driver for structural and floristic heterogeneity, right? Biodiversity and fire are linked. In the absence of fire, Douglas fir forest is expanding into grasslands, shrublands, oak woodland habitats, reducing the biological diversity in these areas. So what that really means is that Douglas fir, unlike coast redwood, is not as resilient to fire. It dies when it's exposed to high intensity heat. And so without those naturally occurring fires on the landscape, the Douglas fir is expanding and replacing other vegetation communities. The overall trend in Marin is one of increasing fire return intervals and decreasing wildfire extent. So increasing fire return intervals means more time between fires, and decreasing extent means smaller fires. The fire return intervals, so the time between fires, have really increased dramatically between 1860 and the 1990s, rising from approximately 10 years to fire every 10 years to a fire every 38 years or more. And this graph just represents that trend. At the same time, the average acres burned per year has significantly decreased, right? Shrinking fire extent, falling from an average of 1% of the total county area, something like 4,000 acres annually between 1852 and 1900, to now just 0.1% since 1960, right? So here's 1960. So we're getting, 400 to 500 acres per year on average, rather than 4,000. It's shrinking fire extent. It should be noted that the fire return intervals prior to colonization and Euro-American record keeping were highly variable. And while some areas may have experienced more fire frequency as a result of Coast Miwok burning, fire return intervals of several hundred years have been documented, particularly in mesic areas. So that mesic means wet, right? So in wet areas, you may have had hundreds of years without fire. So it's, highly variable depending on where you're talking about on the landscape. But the big takeaway is that no fire is not good for vegetation communities, and really is a legacy of colonization, right? So let's shift gears from the impacts of fire exclusion to talking about tree mortality and impacts from forest disease or forest pathogens. Many of you may have heard of sudden oak death. Sudden oak death is caused by this pathogen. The Latin word is Phytophthora ramorum. This introduced pathogen causes sudden oak death and was first documented in the United States in Marin County, on Marin Municipal Water District and state parklands in 1995. Vegetation mapping completed by the Water District and their consultant AIS, I should spell that out, Aerial Information Systems, between 2004 and 2009 tracked this rapid spread of sudden oak death and the related tree mortality on Mount Tamalpais watershed lands. And in 2014, they updated that study and found that over 90% of oak woodlands within the study area were affected by this disease, along with 84% of all forested areas. So mortality and the impacts of this pathogen were detected across all of the key forest types that we analyzed in the forest health strategy. These alter the fuel arrangements, the structure, and the composition of affected forests. So this map is sort of a heat map showing where we have concentrated areas of canopy mortality in forested lands. Across Marin County, we found a substantial portion of native forests have a little bit to a medium amount of canopy mortality. That's 13,000 impacted acres. And then an additional 5,000 acres, or 5% of all forests, had really high levels, relatively high levels of mortality in 2018. This analysis has some limitations. It's limited to mortality that we can see in the forest canopy using aerial imagery. So it probably underrepresents the extent of pathogen impacts in the understory, particularly in areas where resprouting sudden oak death affected tan oaks sort of have this cycle where they succumb to pathogen impacts and then sort of resprout. And that it's like a cycle of kind of growth and decline. And we're not able to really see that using aerial imagery. So this result is, a very conservative or probably on the low side of what the actual impacts of pathogens are on the landscape in Marin. Sticking with mortality and forest pathogens for one more slide to talk about mortality in Bishop pine forests, which is related to a different disease, pitch pine canker disease, which is caused by the pathogen Fusarium circinatum. This mortality could also be connected to another pathogen called Western gall rust, which really affects late cereal or old growth, like 80 to 100-year-old bishop pine trees. And it could be some just natural die off of the trees as well. It's hard to tell what the cause of the mortality is just using aerial imagery analysis, but there's definitely something going on in the bishop pine forests. And that's what this map really shows. It's like all this bright red over here are bishop pine. It could also be that hardwood tree species that are susceptible to sudden oak death, the other pathogen I mentioned, especially tan oak or coast live oak, they could be included in some of this mapped mortality in these bishop pine areas. So you can't really tell the exact species of the affected tree by looking at aerial imagery. But we know that there's something going on here. It's affecting both bishop pines and probably the oaks in that area as well. Then looking at coast redwood and Douglas fir forests, and I'll just toggle back and forth real quick so you can see the change in the map. This is the bishop pine forests. This is the Douglas fir and coast redwood forests. So the canopy mortality in these forests is related to pathogen impacts to those hardwood associates of coast redwood and Douglas fir. So it's not the coast redwood and Douglas fir themselves that are showing disease and have foliage that's dying, but really the hardwood kind of components of these forests. Pathogen-induced decline of the common associates of coast redwood and Douglas fir, again, such as tan oak, Pacific madrone. There's another pathogen out there in the landscape called Phytophthora cinnamomi, which has also been detected on Marin watershed lands on Mount Tam, and it can cause hardwood tree decline and mortality. Lastly, on mortality and pathogen impacts, canopy mortality was mapped across all of the open canopy oak woodland types. And this is really interesting to just see the different distribution of different forest types. Again, I just went backwards to show you on this map the distribution of coast redwood and Douglas fir, kind of in the central and western parts of Marin. And then these are all the oak woodlands, right? They like that drier habitat. So they're on the eastern side of the county. We also found mortality in those forests and woodlands. It was mapped across all the different types of oaks, but was higher in stands dominated by species that we know are affected by sudden oak death. Those include coast live oak, California black oak, and canyon live oak, as well as hardwood associates of those species, again, tan oak being really susceptible to that sudden oak death. Okay, we're going to move to, and I only have a few more slides, so I hope that people have questions. There are key findings on invasive plants. So we didn't have enough data at the countywide scale to assess the presence or absence of non-native invasive species in the understory of forests as kind of a metric for assessing forest health at the countywide scale. So it's really hard to kind of, using aerial imagery, see what's underneath the trees and what species of weeds might be there. However, our fine scale vegetation map that we developed after the peak health report, that countywide spatial data, is still a useful data set for highlighting the distribution of non-native invasive trees and shrubs at the landscape scale in Marin. So this just shows you kind of some of the weeds that were mapped as part of this work in southern Marin. the ability of non-native invasive species to reduce biological diversity, degrade habitat, coupled with evidence that some types, such as eucalyptus, can contribute to fuel conditions that are more commonly associated with hazardous wildfire behavior, makes a pretty compelling case for active management to protect and increase forest resilience and ecological function wherever we can. Our partners do a lot of invasive plant management, so that the efforts that come out of the forest health strategy are largely seek to leverage the ongoing work of OneTAM and our partners on invasive plant monitoring and management. This includes early detection, rapid response, and invasive plant monitoring and management. So early detection just means finding weeds before they become really widespread and difficult and expensive to control. So we have really good botanists out there that do surveys looking for new infestations of newly introduced weeds, which is a much more cost-effective way to try and manage the problem of the spread of invasive plants. Okay, second to last slide, next steps for our work. I just want to center that the OneTAM partners should build and strengthen relationships with the Federated Indians of Grattan Rancheria to integrate Coast Miwok knowledge and perspective into the study, use, and management of forests that are of interest to the tribe. We started that process by including the tribe in development of the forest health strategy, and having Dr. Peter Nelson, who's both a Coast Miwok tribal citizen as well as an associate professor at University of Berkeley, write this chapter on Indigenous stewardship and tribal partnership. But that's just a first step, and we know that as work kind of comes out of the forest health strategy, we need to continue to build that relationship with the tribe and involve them on decisions and planning for forest health in the future. We also want to collaborate on strengthening the data collection and evaluation of forest health as part of the projects that we advance. Field-based inventories and community science initiatives such as Marin Wildlife Watch, OneTAM's Rare Plant Program, our bat monitoring program, and others. We want to develop coordinated countywide treatment tracking, and because that's that feedback loop that I mentioned. It can be used to measure project outcomes and inform future management. So I put this link in here because this is such a cool initiative, the Marin Wildfire Picture Index Project, now called Marin Wildlife Watch. You all can go on here and look at what the results of an array of camera traps have captured across Marin County to document wildlife occurrences. It is so fun to go through and look at the different pictures of skunks and deer and coyotes and foxes and so much more. So it's a great initiative, and we think really harnessing that to kind of track changes in forests over time is a really smart move. And then lastly, and importantly, the OneTAM partners will continue to work together to advance opportunities to fundraise for, plan, develop, implement projects and programs to increase forest health and resilience in Marin County. As outlined in the forest health strategy, this includes partnering across jurisdictional boundaries, collaborating with the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority and other fire departments in Marin County to expand the use of beneficial fire in Marin County. And I guess I didn't have a bullet that talked about beneficial fire, but we talked about the impacts of fire exclusion, the elimination of fire from the landscape through cultural burning and also naturally occurring wildfire. So there, the one obvious tool in the toolbox is to get good fire, beneficial fire back on the landscape through prescribed fire, so intentionally putting fire on the ground to get those benefits, or working with the tribe to do cultural burning. And both of those things should be on the table, and that's one of our key findings. I put this graphic on here to kind of give you a sense of what it means to increase resilience. We talked a little bit about, resilience as a concept, but I think, this really hits home for me. In the green, you have a healthy forest. A healthy forest has high resilience. And this this bucket with this little peak here is really meant to underscore that there's like a tipping point. Right. So down here, this healthy forest has high resilience. It's deep in this well. It's able to withstand, different shocks. We talked about, a disturbance like a major wildfire coming through, but the forest is able to naturally regenerate because it's healthy. Right. So that's high resilience. Then as tree stress these stressors, the things I talked about, pathogens, fire exclusion, non-native invasive plants, those start to kind of affect forest health and they increase in area, the resilience of the forest moves from this high resilient state to a high or low kind of, the resilience is affected, right? And this tipping point could be reached, at which point you get a change, right? So a very unhealthy forest has low resilience. This is pretty intuitive, I know, but it just kind of, I think this graphic just really underscores that what we're trying to do by addressing the impacts of these threats and stressors to forest health is to keep the resilience high and wherever we can. So shorter way of saying that is the resilience is the capacity of systems to absorb or recover from disturbance while undergoing change to retain desired ecosystem services and functions within a mosaic of forest types. Those ecosystem services that we talked about at the beginning are things like recreation opportunities, clean air, clean water, cultural values, all that the forests provide, wildlife habitat. So we want to retain those services by addressing threats to forest health and keeping these forest systems resilient, recognizing that change is a natural part of systems. So last slide, ways to get involved. And again, these slides will be made available to all of you on the San Francisco Public Library's website. And so these links are active and you'll be able to use them. When the forest health strategy is published later this month, you can just access it yourself and look at the documents. We'll have a link, and that's the link where they'll be. We're going to have a tour on May 6th, a forest health tour for those of you that can make it out to Lake Lagunitas on Mount Tamalpais. That's on Mount Tamalpais watershed lands. I'll be there giving a similar talk, but doing it while we can look at trees together. That's part of the One Tam Science Summit series. We have a June 21st summer solstice forest health tour planned. That's for One Tam members. One Tam we're a membership agency, right? Like you can subscribe and become a member. There's different levels of membership, and then you get to come to some events like this. So if you have some extra money and want to become a member, anyone can become a member. Weekends in June, we're going to have this cool TAM van, we call it. It's our mobile trailhead. It'll be stationed all June at Lake Lagunitas on Mount Tamalpais, and there'll be some cool programming associated with forest health, self-guided tour, things like that. So if you can't come to the June 21st, that's okay. You could just go out on your own one weekend to Mount Tam, Lake Lagunitas, and find the TAM van and engage with us that way. And as I mentioned at the outset, we do have a calendar that hosts lots of volunteer opportunities, lists other events. If you want to get out and pull weeds, things like that, we do have opportunities like that as well. So with that, I just want to thank you for your attention, the opportunity to share today, and we'll take any questions or just have some discussion.
Thanks, Danny. There is a couple questions. Well, I think you hit on it, but how else are you continuing to work with the Coastal Miwok?
Yeah, that's a great question. So our partner agencies like the Park Service and California State Parks have staff, cultural resource staff that are dedicated to building relationships and working with the Coast Miwok and the Federated Indians of Grat and Rancheria just as part of their job, right? Those conversations and collaborations are ongoing. They're always ongoing. There's a couple of different ways that our work touches the tribe. One of them is when we do projects, there's a compliance process involved with that, like a regulatory process. And as part of that regulatory process, agencies are required to consult with the tribe before doing projects, right? So you probably heard, some folks have probably heard of the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA, or the National Environmental Protection Act, NEPA. Those laws and regulations require agencies to work with tribes when they're doing work that could impact cultural resources. So that's one very clear point of connection. On the programmatic side and specific to forest health, actually, I'm meeting with representatives of the Federated Indians of Grat and Rancheria along with the author of the Forest Health Chapter on Indigenous Stewardship and Tribal Partnership, Peter Nelson. We're meeting on Monday to talk about next steps for collaborating on this work. And my hope is that out of that conversation and listening and sharing can come opportunities for the tribe to have representatives at talks like this. So I would love to co-present this talk with someone from the tribe. I think that would be a really powerful and impactful program. I mentioned hikes and other opportunities to kind of get outdoors. And I'd love to kind of co-present or co-deliver programs with representatives of the tribe when we talk about forest health. And then the tribe can talk more about some of the traditional tribal knowledge that they have, indigenous uses of plants, right? And they can speak for themselves and share that knowledge. And it's not, someone like me appropriating that information and giving it to you on the tribe's behalf, which we don't really want to do. And then I think those are the main ways, right? We just want to kind of continue the conversation around forest health. Obviously, when there's projects and active management that's going to happen, there's a process that the agencies have for integrating the tribe into that process. It's more formal and has a legal framework. But from my perspective, I would just like to continue to involve the tribe in talking about this work by co-presenting, being a part of walks and hikes, and doing some of their own interpretation of traditional tribal knowledge in these spaces on Mount Tam and elsewhere in Marin County.
Love it. Thank you. Another question. Could you speak to how your forest health strategy will inform prioritization of projects?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we talked about, and I shared some of the different forest health stressors that we were able to kind of uncover through this analysis. What we're doing is we're overlaying those areas that are impacted by forest health stressors, right? So whether it's invasive plants or areas that are showing high impacts from fire exclusion, or their vegetation communities that we know are need fire to be healthy and haven't had fire in a really long time, or areas that have those pathogen impacts, right? So sudden oak death, pitch pine canker, areas where we can see that the forests, and we've documented and mapped where the forest has really heavily impacts from these pathogens. Those are areas where the forest is sort of out of sync, right? Where the resilience is low. So those are part of our prioritization framework. And then we layer on another thing that really gives us called our feasibility analysis, which really just gives us at a high level, at the landscape level, an idea of where places are accessible, right? Because we're talking about forested landscapes. So these are not, some places are really not accessible by machines or even hand crews to do manual work, right? They're too steep, they're too dangerous, they're too far away from roads and trails. We just physically can't get people and equipment out to those spaces to do forestry work. So we have a way of kind of looking at the landscape, looking at what's feasible from an access perspective, and then looking at where we have the areas that are highly impacted by some of those forest health stressors that we talked about today. And those are the areas that rank highly in our prioritization framework. There's also a lot of other things that go into prioritization. Certainly cultural values and conversations with the tribe. Like there are places that are special and important to the tribe where they want to see forest management happen. So that's a prioritization criteria. And there are other things too, like endangered species habitat. So places where we have federally listed salmonids like coho salmon or steelhead trout, and where the forests really are providing, critical habitat for those fish species, cooling shade, which, cools of pool water, or what fish need, right, when they're in the river. And so doing work to kind of make sure that we address the resilience of those forested areas so that we're protecting that critical habitat for fish, that feeds into our prioritization model. So it's actually quite complex, and that's just a really high level overview of prioritization, but we have a whole chapter on it in the forest health strategy. So when that's published, if you're the person that asked that question wants to read more, we have a whole chapter that you could explore on that thinking.
Wow, thank you. So I do have a couple questions too about monitoring, and try to do this in one thing, but can you talk a little more about what monitoring looks like for these projects? Yes.
Yes, yeah. Monitoring is a big subject, and we have a whole chapter on it in the strategic plan. So I can just break it down for you at a high level, right? Like monitoring is something that similar to the connections with the tribe as part of project compliance, right? So that kind of Environmental Quality Act, that National Environmental Protection Act, there's a legal framework for monitoring that's required, kind of at a bare minimum for these types of projects, especially when you're working around sensitive plants and animal species, right? So there's a regulatory framework that requires certain amount of monitoring, which means like botanists, wildlife biological monitors, cultural monitors, if it's a cultural resource that could be impacted. It means people on the ground, checking for sensitive areas, making sure that the work doesn't impact those sensitive areas or sensitive species or sensitive resources. So that's like a bare minimum of monitoring. And then really quickly, like the other layers of monitoring that we're interested in are, things like the wildlife camera project, Marin Wildlife Watch, looking at where we're placing treatments on the landscape and looking at changes in the occupancy of wildlife or bird species, for example, right? So we have baseline understanding from Marin Wildlife Watch and other wildlife monitoring, like nesting bird surveys prior to projects, so that we have a pretty good idea of what the wildlife dynamics are prior to implementing a project. So following on that monitoring, so looking at to try and establish trends to evaluate the benefits, the impact of our work, good or bad, hopefully good. Usually designed to be good, but there are always unintended consequences. So that's why monitoring is really important. And then the third layer of monitoring that I'll just quickly mention is sort of this landscape level monitoring. A lot of the work, you can tell, as part of our forest health strategy has been to map things like vegetation communities. So when you think about remapping the distribution of vegetation communities and then looking at the relationship of those changes to where we have done treatments on the landscape, that can really inform at kind of a really big, county-wide scale across those 118,000 acres of forests in Marin County. Where have we placed treatments? What have been the changes on the landscape, and how do we think those treatments may have contributed to either changes or not changes, right? Maybe we increase the resilience of a place. We have a wildfire and we find that place comes back as coast redwood forest like it was prior to the fire. And we find that we did some treatments in there. That's another level of monitoring that kind of happens at the landscape scale. So everything from on the ground all the way up.
Wow. That's all so deep, but yet thank you for making it very accessible, Danny. Do we have any more questions? And there's some thank yous from our YouTube, and that monitoring question did come from YouTube. It looks like we have answered all of the questions. Your last chance, friends, to ask Danny a question. It was a lot of information. And you can watch this and all of our other nature boosts on YouTube. I will be editing this a little bit later on tomorrow, so take away some of my unmutedness earlier. All right, I think we look good. I'm gonna put one last time. Let's put in the OneTam website. Thank you, Danny, so much, and our friends at the Conservancy.
Thank you.
We appreciate you being here today, and library community, as always, we appreciate you being here.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for your
attention.
attention.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you, friends. There, you see all the chat, right, Danny?
I do see it. Thank you, everybody.
Good.